Welcome back from the conversation on the staircase to these halls, where I would like to start with the remark that in these times in which the world's maddening noises threaten to drown all else out, reading as well as tender conversations offer solace and strength, at least for me. My name is Anna Jäger, and I'm very much looking forward to this conversation with the writers Maaza Mengiste, who joins us from New York, Yvonne Adhiambo Owuor, who's in Nairobi, and Petina Gappah in Edinburgh. Hello, hello. Good to see you. Even if in these new daily cages that we are kept in now. With regards to time, we had agreed earlier to not go into biographical details and recitals of accolades. I'm going to break this rule only a little bit by sending all our warm congratulations to Maaza, whose novel Shadow King is, as of yesterday's news, included in the shortlist of the Booker Prize, which is really amazing, and all our blessings and thumbs to you. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
Our brief conversation now on things of song follows the ways to and through echoing history, as well as memory and amnesia. We will look into the archives that you find beyond shelves, in bodies and other landscapes, in music, found objects, cartography, family memory, the list could go on much longer. In which ways do imagination and narration question the established archives of history with the capital H? How are imagination and narration archive making in themselves, extending or even blowing up the idea of the archive? And Maaza, I would like to start with this look at or understanding and reading the body as an archive, which I also think in your latest novel, we follow the body, the female body especially, in a resistance and fighting mode. And you know, that very particular circumstance, but also to read that body then, you know, with all the violations, the strengths that were put up to.
Yeah, I think, thank you for that, Anna. And I have to say that it's really a pleasure and an honor for me to be here to talk to you, to talk with Petina and Yvonne, who are two writers that I admire and have admired for so many years. So thank you for inviting me here. In terms of, I think one of the things that I wanted to portray in my novel, and something that I've often thought about, is the way that women's bodies become both trophies and territories of conquest in any kind of conflict, whether it's a domestic conflict or whether it's an international global conflict, you know, in war. Women's bodies have often been used as markers for manhood, for masculinity, for ownership of different countries. And I started looking at photographs of women, how they've been used through the colonial era to justify conquest and abuse and oppression of African and Asian countries. And I wondered what those photographs might tell us about the way that women's bodies have also been camouflage for the cruelties of men. And I, very briefly, because I would love to hear from the other panelists, but not long ago in my research, I came across an album that was full of women and girls taken by Italian soldiers during this war with Ethiopia. These were East African women and girls, and most of them were in various states of undress. They were nude. These were abusive photographs, but those photographs had locations on them of where they were taken in Ethiopia. And once I put those locations on a map, I discovered that those locations were also sites for extermination camps and execution prisons. So whoever this soldier was that was traveling through these locations and photographing women was taking part in that violence, but the women's bodies were used as an archive for another kind of memory. And I was really, it still is a difficult thing for me to look at that album, but this is women's bodies have been used. These are, they contain memories that have often been so brutal that to look at a body is often the only way that we can mark what else has happened in a country or in a location. So thank you for your question, because I've been thinking about that album for a while now.
And I think it also ties what you just brought up to that idea of, not idea, but the very close connection between, you know, archives and photographs and also a cartography, you know, a soil that is violated also, and that is, you know, has an entrance into, you know, a writing and imagined geography then in the writing with all these, and with all that it's buried in that soil.
Yes, and I know with Petina's work also, you know, this excavating of history, and Yvonne's book. I remember Yvonne's work from the time I was an undergraduate student, and these intersections of politics, and bodies, and memory, and the archives, how they warp history and what we're supposed to remember. I mean, this is why I'm so glad to be on this panel, because these are two other writers who are doing similar kinds of work. What we are told to remember is not necessarily the way things happened.
I was just waiting if you want to continue.
Oh, me?
No,
I want to hear from them.
if one of you wants to. No. Yeah, but Yvonne, maybe you can, you know, with regards to writing in and through and of landscape, you know, and the political aspect of not only, you know, in writing about maybe histories and what is so-called past, which I think often in landscape especially is a good reminder of what is also still very present, you know, also in the political framework of it. And I think, as Maaza mentioned, in a lot of your work, the landscape becomes another protagonist, and the way you really masterfully holding all these elements as well, you know, that make a landscape. It gives this urgency of place and placelessness, and the violations of places, language.
Right. Just to reiterate what Maaza said, her thank yous. It's such a pleasure being with each and every single one of you. It's a privilege, especially in this particular time. About the landscape and also embodied memories. I draw a lot also from the ways of our own cultures. I think in each one of our cultural spaces, certainly from within the African continent, the idea of landscape as holders of memories, as witnesses to the human experience, still resonates, even though a lot of that has been overwritten by a lot of what passes as the way of knowledge now. It's necessary, certainly also as an artist for me, that landscape features, because before I begin a story, all stories for me begin in a landscape. The Dragonfly Sea was about the being in front of the ocean, actually being in front of the River Congo, and somehow that summons the ocean. As an artist, landscape enters into my work because it is the site in which the story appears. But the notion of landscape, and especially in literature and in the contestation and the wrestling of African histories is particularly significant, given that the geographies we now inhabit are artificial geographies, are geographies that cut across historical realities and cultures and lives and worldviews. And perhaps it's a point that as citizens of this particular, the big African landscape, is one of the points that one of the points we ourselves need to come into either make peace with or engage with in one way or another. And I guess those particular contradictions and paradoxes do show up in the literature one journeys through.
Petina, I think, especially with this regards to your latest novel, this element of trying or being on a quest of burying the interior organs of someone who called themselves an explorer of that was already there and that has already been worked on, walked on, and been also told about, is another, I think, look at this and also the crossing back of the land and and by the, let's say, the entourage and the all the personnel that was needed back in colonial times, that David Livingstone in his explorations was surrounded by, and after his death, finding a place to bury parts of him in that very soil.
No, thank you so much, Anna. And just as Yvonne and Maaza said so well, it's such a pleasure to be here having this wonderful discussion with two writers I admire so very much. And I was nodding away listening to both Maaza and Yvonne because there's so much that connects us in terms of what we're interested in as writers, as thinkers, as Africans as well. And I just love that question, Anna, thank you, because it allows me to explain that one of my missions in writing Out of Darkness, Shining Light, my big Livingstone novel that I wrote over 20 years, was to bring him down to earth, was to take him from the pedestal and put him right on earth. So the most illiterate woman in the party constantly makes fun of him. And she says, are you crazy? You have some cloth, you're not very rich, obviously your teeth are bad, you're quite old, and you probably won't find a nice young wife. But for heaven's sake, why are you going around looking for the beginning of a river that's been there since time began and is going to be there long after you've gone into the earth? So the idea that Livingstone was on a fool's errand, right? Because imagine how he must have appeared to the Africans. Hi, everybody, I'm here. I'm looking for the source of the Nile. They're like, what? First of all, you're going in the wrong direction. You're going south. The Nile is that way. But also, I mean, just the ludicrousness of it all. He would come to a body of water and say, I now name this Lake Victoria. I now name this lake. And you're like, dude, the places have names. So I wanted to just have fun with that aspect. That here's this egotistical, incredibly egotistical man who's going around naming bits of Africa that are already named. So I had a lot of fun with that aspect. And I also had a lot of fun with opening him up. I mean, opening him up as a character and also opening him up as a body, right? Because one of the things they had to do, so in the Victorian myth, they say his companions, Chuma and Susi, his faithful companions, buried his heart in Africa and stretched for 9 months with his body. Well, they had to bury his heart in Africa. They had to do something with his heart and his spleen and his liver and his small intestine and his large intestine. So they basically eviscerated him, took out all the inside bits, buried them in a biscuit tin, right? Shoveled it over, and then they had to dry the body. I think it was 6 days one side, 6 days the other. So it was a practical consideration. It wasn't a romantic, oh, this man loved Africa so much, let's bury his heart on our soil. It was a very practical consideration.
It was a mortuary process.
Yes, it was. It was. They actually did like a...
It was. They did a proper,
I have to say,
autopsy, a proper autopsy. You separate the
absolutely, and they even
subpoena.
did like yeah. So one of the guys who opened him up, Karas Farah, was a doctor's assistant. So he knew what bodies looked like. So they actually made detailed notes, the state of his liver, the state of his lungs, and so on and so on. And basically, he seemed to have died of some kind of cancer, which they documented without what they were documenting. But I must say that writing that section where I opened up his body, I really unleashed my inner Stephen King, man. That was a lot of fun.
Hilarious.
A proper post-structural and deconstructural writing.
Deconstructed. That's what I did. I deconstructed Livingston.
But also in terms of perspective and who's narrating the story, flipping that script, not only bringing him down from the pedestal, not only on soil but in it. I think that the very same works also by who you are telling the story through and whose languages you're telling the story through, not only in this very important status of witnessing from different African perspectives, but also just by that showing very much how much trade and exchange and cultural inspiration was already going on, So it's not about this false claim of purity in whatever culture, language, that this untouched idea of what the explorers discovered is already through the positions you tell the story with dismantled again and dissected, because maybe we stay in this imagery now.
I think, Anna, you should go around talking about my book. You certainly talk about it more intelligently than I do. But I want to bring Maaza in for a bit, because one of the things I really loved about The Shadow King was this idea of, what the South Asian scholars call the subaltern view of history. This idea of us just, the great men are standing in the shadows. We've got Mussolini's shadow all over Italy and so on. But we don't hear about the soldiers who resisted him. We don't hear about the women who resisted him, So for me, Herat's story, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, Maaza, Herat's story was just the most incredible opening up to a history of a very fascinating country, right? A history that I know from school, having studied, the history of colonization and so on. But, I think there's something special that historical fiction allows us to do, which is, fiction is the best way we have of understanding other lives anyway. But historical fiction gives us that extra something. And if you do it well as Yvonne and Maaza do, it really allows you to look at history, large events from the perspectives of very small lives. And I think that's very beautiful.
Thank you, Petina. I think, it's interesting to think of these characters, the women in my book. I've thought of them as a part of a continuum of what's always been happening across Africa in different liberation movements. The Ethiopian women that fought against Mussolini were not the first Ethiopians to fight against Italian invasion. That was in the late 1890s or 1800s. But we've seen this in Nigeria, we've seen this in South Africa, we've seen this in Kenya, we've seen women and girls rise up again and again. But the question that I would always ask once I kept discovering stories of women is, what happened? Why is it that the history with a capital H doesn't have these stories in there? And it's made me think about how the first draft of history is often the history written by men. And then it's up to the writers, the fiction writers, the researchers, all of us then come and begin to rework that first draft. One day we will be able to write that first draft. But when I thought about, it wasn't until the end of my book, it was done, and I was in the last parts of editing it. That was when I discovered that my great-grandmother had fought or had enlisted in this war. So I didn't know this story at all until the very, very end. And I talked to the women in my family, and everyone knew this story but me, partly because I lived here and I wasn't there with them. But it makes me think about the places where the alternative, not even alternative, but that other side of history, where is that told? I could imagine that my great-grandmother with her daughter, with my mother and her sisters, spoke about these stories of other women, of my great-grandmother in the kitchen, in places where women sit and share stories without ever being told that they're history, that is also history. Whereas men can sit at a dinner party and pontificate, and that's a historical account of something, and then eventually it migrates to the classroom. It's these places that are intimate, where I think our stories exist. And it makes me really grateful for the work that Petina does and Yvonne that you do, because it's an excavation that's happening by women who speak to other women, who are actually listening. Because these women haven't been voiceless. It's that we haven't learned how to hear them. And I completely, this work of the, I'm thinking of Livingstone's body being ripped apart and his insides being taken out. I mean, what a perfect metaphor for what we do with history. And then, we find out it's cancerous.
No. Earlier, Anna, you talked about you talked about the archive and the imagination, and the role of the writer in terms of opening up the archive or contesting the archive. I think one of the things we forget is once, even if we valorize or institutionalize the archive, it is still the work of someone's imagination. The choices, the editing, and I think part of the questioning of certainly the artist needs to possibly asks is it's not about whose archive, but more whose imagination of archive, whose imagination of history. And that then opens up, I think, a hell of a lot of possibilities in terms of the trajectory of story. So Petina opens up Livingstone's body. Maaza opens up the intimate stories of fierce women. The Dragonfly Sea, the book, lays claim to the sea and offer and
You're
returns
opening up the whole Indian Ocean.
It is, yes, and to own, not just own it, but to name it in the way that it has been named by our peoples, and the contestation of the amputation of that, the narrative that goes out that. When I was doing some of the research, maybe I won't name the researchers, the lie that the African engagement with the ocean is as cargo on somebody else's boat, the myth that the African confronted with the ocean is in absolute terror, but understanding that lie became necessary, and that lie is then compounded in the name these waters are given, in order to sustain and perpetuate a diminishing of a people, of a human being. So our work then becomes it's more than excavation. We're exhuming. We're exhuming the grave and acting as forensic anthropologists.
We're exhuming. We are reclaiming.
Yes.
And it just struck me,
Yes.
Yvonne, how absurd that an ocean that touches all of East Africa is called the Indian Ocean.
And that's
right?
a 17th century naming.
Yeah, on the other side, we have the Atlantic. So we have no claim to the ocean at any point. That's really fascinating.
It was deliberate, Petina. It was deliberate. It was deliberately done because at that time the British particularly wanted, that whole thing, reign Britannia, Britannia rules the seas. I think the Western mindset at that time could not having imagined having instituted the fantasy of this scientific racism, the idea of African agency of the ocean was completely, they were not able to. It was impossible for them to accommodate that. So the naming of the ocean it's a very late naming. The Indians and the Gujarats themselves had a different name for this particular seas. So the, and the naming was the fantasy of the British what do you call it, Navy, who wanted access to India. And and when that ridiculousness, you talked about the absurdities become instituted and as history and
Yeah.
enter into the geographical, and then we then repeat the nonsense and make it a feature of our lives.
Yeah.
I've got
Sorry,
a
goes.
problem with
Sorry,
that.
Anna. I'm very excited by this because there's such a wonderful synergy between what we're all doing. I remember Yvonne in Lamu back in 2007 when Dear Binya was still with us. I used to hear
Yes.
these stories about these giraffes that went to from
Admiral
Malindi.
Jong Ho, yes.
Yes. So we can't prove absolutely that happened, but we can lay claim to those stories in the books that we write, right? We can't rewrite history in that sense, but we can unearth,
But Petina, the thing is,
and
we can lay
uncover.
claim. We can,
Yeah,
we
that's
can
the
actually
thing.
claim it happened. The evidence is there. The maritime archaeologist, Dr. Georgia Bongo, together with Beijing University, they're incredible discoveries. Not just
Wow.
porcelain, but also the lost yonks. And we were talking about embodied history in the bodies of the men and women and children of Pate Island. It's there. Their history's there. It's written in their blood, in their DNA finding, in DNA tests. That which they have said for hundreds of years, which historians encountered and say, no, that's fantastical. Even in the face of the evidence they saw in the body. Yes, they're there. It was right there. It was right there all this time.
Wow.
Yeah, I think just to, and also the way the effects are until now is like also this agency within world history. What you were just saying, to me it was the biggest absurdity, the way until this very day the history of globalization has been told from coming from Europe through like very late. I mean, are you kidding? Look at, and the Indian
Very, very
Ocean
late
for me,
arrivals.
I mean, the way we write it in history book, they claim for a very late start of a globalized world. And I always thought that the whole Indian Ocean and all the cultures it connects is the evidence that you have already on your map. Yes, there were attempts to rename it, to twist this this history, but it's actually even impossible. It's such a bold move to do. The whole coast, Swahili coast, bears all these marks, as you said, in the bodies, in the architecture, and also, then on the other coasts that border that ocean. So it's such brutal lying in the face of evidences, in the way also world history is told.
But
I wonder
yeah,
My
why.
it's
current
not.
obsession at the moment. Sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say
Go
my
on.
current obsession at the moment is precisely that, what Anna and you were just talking about, and also Yvonne, this idea that we have to find that there is a history that Africa had before colonialism, a history of trade, the Mutapa
Absolutely.
Empire, Great Zimbabwe, the Malindi giraffes, all those wonderful things. And my
Yes.
mom is a person of the Remba people who are sort of, we can't quite work out whether they're Zimbabwean Jews or Zimbabwean Muslims, right? But their DNA, right, is actually has a lot in common with people in Israel and with some of the Ethiopian Jews. interesting to me, this idea of a history that you feel in the blood, a history that existed before colonialism and that has been passed down in the blood. And I'm also currently obsessed with Vasco da Gama. You know, my Twitter name is Vasco da Gama because I used to travel a lot before lockdown. But Vasco da Gama sent out priests right around the world, and he said, "I'm looking for Christians and spices." So I'm sort of like tracing that journey of one of the priests that went into the Mutapa Empire and converted the Mutapa, who was the emperor at the time. And this was way before colonialism. So I just love this idea of, as you say, Anna, finding a globalization that existed before even the West got involved.
In tapping into aspects of the future, given the realities, maybe let me comment. Gosh, guys, what a world we're living in, huh? You know, when they say you're living in interesting, goodness, who knew? Anyway, but given these fluidities and things, and the things coming up, and the fact that China, in certain ways, certainly from the West, is kind of looked at as the bogeyman is coming. I'm curious then, what in terms of imagining futures, I always find it very interesting that when in the few forums that it has come up, not all the time, but a few times, when it mentioned the fact of a longer history between Africa and China, an older history, actually, 1,000-year-old history, the kind of silence that meets that claim, even before the evidence. And I'm curious where that, I suspect I know where that comes from, but I'm interested. I'm interested in your take. What do you guys? Why do you guys think that is the case? Well, as you know, that's a very insincere question.
Yeah, right. I think I was thinking about all of this when it forces a decentering of that what we call world history has always been European history's engagement with the rest of the world. That's what we call world history. But imagine if there were actually conversations happening between China and Africa without the West. What does that say about world history? What does that say about just, you know, the inventions that were developing over those years, over the course of that communication? I find it interesting. I find that it's terrifying for a lot of people because it's going to force a reckoning with who they are today and who they will be in the future, who their ancestors were. I think this, you know, I've been thinking a lot lately about this quote, and it was by Walter Benjamin in the 30s. He said, "If fascism wins, not even our dead will be safe." And I've thought about that in terms of what the work that we're all doing is reclaiming the dead. These are acts of reclamation, but it's to ensure that we have a future that speaks and includes those who look just like us. I mean, God, imagine if you decentered the West in world history. What if world history were African history? What would that say about all the dead and then all that history and the future? I like that vision of the future, but I think it's terrifying for a lot of people. It's a new vocabulary that has to develop, but we're the ones writing it.
You're so right, Maaza. I mean, even just the very gentle suggestion, by the way, it didn't come from any, as far as I know, it didn't come as a Black Lives Matters demand that you shouldn't sing a particular verse of Rule Britannia about Britannia ruling the waves and never, never, never shall the Britain be a slave. I mean, nobody asked them not to sing it. But the suggestion just coming from the BBC met with such a storm of protest. it became kind of, this is the hill I'm going to die on. This is the hill I'm going to die on. And you sort of think, well, if you get this agitated over a song, what more when we try to decenter, right? When we try to decenter whiteness from world history, when we try to decenter Europeans from world history, I mean, there'll be an uproar. There'll be an uproar. So, but that's why for me, I mean, I've been having these conversations a lot with friends in India and friends in Nigeria and other parts of Africa. I think that we need to expend greater effort, not in talking back, because that's done. That's done.
No,
the people, the allies we have, the allies and so on, who want to hear that conversation, they are there, they are with us, they are allies, they are working with us, right? But the real conversation needs to be a South-South one. That's why I love so much what Yvonne said about imagining what China and Africa looked like, 500 years ago, 600 years ago. Those South-South conversations, I want to go to Ethiopia, right? I want to go to Israel to meet Ethiopian Jews who are connected to Zimbabwe. I want to go to India to understand their specific experience of colonialism and what we in Africa can learn from it. I want to go to Brazil. I want to travel in brown countries. I want to have those conversations with my fellow brownies and with Anna.
Yeah. I do not think the decentralization conversation would necessarily diminish the West. I think it would, in the words of the prophet, it's a truth that will set everybody free. I cannot imagine how much energy is expended sustaining a mythology that diminishes others. To sustain a lie, it takes too much energy and too much strength. And I mean, I think we're weary. I think everybody's weary of the mythologies and the historical lies that then offer themselves as truth. I think everyone is tired, really. So I imagine this can be a space of human empowerment, and maybe we will all remember how to be human again.
I like that.
There's one thought I had in this, what we also talked briefly about in the preparation, that this idea of the archive is connected to a past, to a history, while we're dealing with the simultaneity, of several times at the same time. And I wondered if, for you as writing, how much you hit the limits of linearity in narrating stories, by looking closely, dissecting, archives that are, again, I mean the ones that are beyond the shelves also, but and making them very present in their presence, which always means the connection to the past and the future.
Well, I mean, I think part of what we're talking about today is this refocusing the emphasis on the West in history. Looking at the archives, the one thing that it showed me was that archives are narratives that have been created, that have been saved to create a collective memory of something that may not necessarily be true. For example, just my work in the fascist archives, I quickly learned that I was reading mostly propaganda. These were documents that had been saved. They were saved because they weren't destroyed, and they weren't destroyed because Mussolini approved of them. And so they were saving history in the way that they wanted to reconstruct a future. And what we do when we work with the archives is not just looking at the past, but in order to figure out who we were, so that we can shift vocabulary to become or to affirm who we are now and who the future, the possibilities of the future. That begins the work begins in the past. I've always thought, and let me see if this makes sense, but I've always thought that the work in the archive is really the work for reclaiming a future. It's not about the past. It is reclaiming those people who have passed, but understanding that the responsibility is for that future generation, so that they can walk through this world comfortable in the fact that they have always belonged, that they have always been there. And so that archive for me is really a future blueprint, but we have to dissect that. I mean, we're coming back to mortuary talk thanks to Petina, but we need to dissect that and excavate and exhume it, and I think and hold it up to light. But all of this is happening at once, and I think you're absolutely right. There is no. I'm really curious about novels that begin to look at the structure of a novel in such a way that addresses the multilinearity of what we're living through right now, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I just wanted to comment. Thank you for saying that, Maaza, because it suddenly then struck me that the work then, the futuring, the archive as future, is also therapeutic. It's a kind of appeasing and a healing of a wound, a historical wound, it just struck me that that's and the wound, the beneficiaries of the healing would be the generation to come. So I just wanted to mention that. Yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
It seems that we are almost out of time, I'm told, which feels very wrong, and as if we're just started to talk. There's just one point I also wanted to mention that you have tapped into now already, Maaza, is the elephant in the room, the moment we are in, that feels so historic already, in the way, this shared urgency and tension that we are all in different ways, but in a way at the same time, is like a magnifying glass, making us see clearer the injustices and the inequalities that, of course, have been there. Nothing is new. Almost nothing about the situation is new. We just see them painfully clearer. And there comes urgency with it, and also urgency of witnessing this moment. And I mean, it offers itself already, all these dystopian, very historical imageries and moments we have right now. So I felt very much that this is, at this moment in time, that brings that already, the feeling of being a witness right now of something historic. Which maybe is even more, I mean, sorry, it was not a question, it was opening up as writers, having that kind of maybe observation or a different observation of that situation, and then how to imagine, that archive of our now.
Anna, that's such a fantastic note to end on, because I spent maybe the first 2 months or so of lockdown just completely paralyzed, thinking the world was going to restart. Any minute now, it's going to restart. And then you realize, actually, no. I chose to use that time as a time not only to read much more than I've ever read in my life, or to write much more than I've ever written in my life, but also just to reflect on my own life, to reflect on my goals, on the mistakes I'd made up to then, to reflect on my wonderful father's life. He died at the beginning of January. To reflect on the lessons that he taught me, and also just to reflect, thank you, lovely, just to reflect generally on the state of the world, and, as you say, all this injustice that we see every day, but we just hadn't taken pause, we hadn't taken breath to actually say, hang on, this is not right. So it's really quite extraordinary that this moment where the world stood still, I remember seeing one, because I love aviation. I remember seeing one map of the world where there were no planes going anywhere. It was just the most surreal thing. Just this moment where the world stood still, I think it has allowed us the opportunity to reflect on both the past and the present to see how we can imagine, I think, a more just future.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, and I
Certainly,
think
and this time, oh, sorry. On Maaza.
no, go ahead, Bonnie. Go ahead, please.
Really? Okay. No, just quickly, I was going to say the season has almost acted both as a barometer, but also as a kind of an unmasking, a stripping off of the emperor's fancy dress. The surprise of the failures of the systems that had been certainly presented to us in the South as the template and the be-all and the nirvana of society, the complete failures in the face of a real existential threat, the contradictions that could no longer exist in a society like the US. So the explosion happens and resonates all over the world. But perhaps what more importantly, I mean, the amazing success of the Asians in terms of handling this particular situation, but also countries like, Botswana, Mauritius, some of the African countries, Senegal, for example. So I think there'll be a lot of, as we go through this plague or whatever it is, I think there's going to be a lot of not mere soul searching, but I think a lot of the old gods have fallen down, have come down crashing. But I don't think the upholders of those gods perhaps understand that the world has changed.
Yeah, and one of the things I was thinking about during lockdown, I think like everyone else, I was terrified. And Petina, like you were talking about, I was just completely paralyzed for a while. Then these protests began, and these uprisings started around the world. And if there was ever a moment of hope in this whole pandemic, it was that. It was those moments right after the death of George Floyd, when it felt like the world was moving on a different momentum, that it was possible for change to happen, and it would begin with a generation that's younger than any of us here, sitting here, and that they were going to confront. It was one of those moments where, if I have ever felt hope, throughout this thing, it was then. And it's interesting to look at the progression of these protests and uprisings and see how I feel like I am seeing heroism in those front lines of the protests and demonstrations that are continuing. And we all of us have done research. We look at the past, and I think one of the questions I've often asked when I was writing this book, and even my other one, is how did people do this? How did they have the courage to do this? Who were they before that event, required this act of defiance from them? And we're seeing it now on the streets, on broadcast, to us on social media. I'm in awe of all of those young people that are out there. And if there's anything that's made me think that this system can be smashed and rebuilt to look like us, it feels like it's now. I'm, as terrified as I have been, these people have made me hopeful.
Beautiful note to end on, although that saddens me, to be very honest. I'm very grateful for your generous sharing. This moment that really, for me, is one of these moments as well that you just described, Maaza, of breath. really. So thank you very much for the conversation. And I wish so much we just could go now and have a drink together and continue the conversations. We'll hopefully have that opportunity soon. It was very lovely
Hope
to
so.
see you and also to hear your voices, to hear your impressions. Very grateful to have been with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Hannah.
Thank
you.
Thank you
I'll
so
always
much,
be
guys.
Thank
That's
you
really
all.
lovely. Thank
It was
you.
so wonderful. Thank you, Anna.
I'm just gonna take a quick picture of the screen. It's only a selfie. The only selfie
Oh,
moment I
please
have.
send it to us.
Thank
Oh,
you.
darling. I don't know when I'll ever see you guys, to give you proper hugs. Petina, Maaza, here's a
Vonnie,
virtual
you,
hug.
see you in
Vonnie.
Nairobi, yeah?
Oh,
I'll
yes.
look
Oh,
for
you're
you in
coming.
Nairobi
Okay.
in 2 weeks.
Thank
Yeah.
you
Give
so
me a
much.
call then.
Stay all
Okay.
safe and well.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay.
As this is a very moving and in motion festival and gathering, we will be on our move again to the staircases, this time for a conversation between Zoe, Beck, Karsten of CultureBook, together with Anita Djafari from Litprom, to talk about the ways and walks of literature after they have been published.
Ja, jetzt interessiert mich natürlich ganz besonders, Karsten, wie kommt man auf die Idee, in diesen Zeiten, die ja nicht ganz einfach sind, auch in der Buchbranche, einen neuen Verlag zu gründen?
Aus Neugier natürlich. Wir sind eigentlich schon seit wir denken können, in den verschiedenen Rollen mit Literatur beschäftigt und haben uns auch die internationale Literatur eigentlich immer angeguckt und haben das verfolgt, die Diskurse, die es da gibt, und sind auf so viele interessante und spannende Autorinnen und Autoren und Themen getroffen, die wir noch nicht so richtig repräsentiert fanden in Deutschland. Und dann haben wir gedacht, dann machen wir es halt selbst. Und wir haben relativ leicht angefangen als E-Book-Verlag. Damals war die Schwelle nicht so besonders hoch, dort E-Books zu veröffentlichen, und seit 2017 machen wir ungefähr seit 2017 ein regelmäßiges Programm mit vielen internationalen Autoren und Autoren.
Ich kenne ja nun mal dann auch aus eigener Erfahrung die größeren Verlagshäuser, weil ich da selber dann erschienen bin, und da habe ich dann eben auch gesehen, wie Programmentscheidungen getroffen werden, wie dann eigentlich tolle Bücher nicht aufgenommen werden, weil gewisse Verkaufserwartungen möglicherweise dann unterschritten werden. Und da dachte ich, so ein kleiner Verlag ist da doch deutlich beweglicher. Und da können wir dann wirklich Sachen machen, die wir relevant finden und die einfach gemacht werden müssen, unserer Meinung nach.
Das kann ich mir vorstellen. In den großen Häusern wird vor allen Dingen gerechnet. Also das macht ja auch das Lektorat heutzutage. Die rechnen mehr, als dass sie lektorieren oder mit den Texten umgehen tatsächlich. Und das ist natürlich die große Freiheit, und das kann ich mir vorstellen, der große Reiz, das zu machen, wozu man Lust hat, und das dann auch halt unter die Leute zu bringen. Denn das ist ja auch kein einfaches Unterfangen heutzutage. Und unsere Organisation Litprom hilft ja auch ein bisschen dabei, bei der Vermittlung, bei der Vermarktung. Wir sind als Non-Profit-Agency, wenn man so will, dafür eigentlich da. Das ist unser Ziel, weiter dafür zu sorgen. Denn angefangen hat es damals, und es war leicht zu sagen, wir helfen afrikanischer Literatur oder außereuropäischer Literatur praktisch hier ans Licht zu kommen, also so eine Art Hebammenfunktion, und haben alles unterstützt mit einem Übersetzungsförderungsprogramm, was es immer noch gibt. Und dann waren aber auch die Zuschreibungen sehr, sehr einfach. Wir waren dafür da, um dritte Weltliteratur zu promoten, zu pushen. Der Auftrag war ganz klar. Das hat sich natürlich jetzt nach 40 Jahren vollständig verschoben. Also ihr seid eine andere Generation als die Gründergeneration, zu der ich auch gehöre. Ihr seid ganz anders international unterwegs sowieso, also ganz persönlich, mit Reisen, mit Erfahrungen und natürlich dann auch vielleicht anderen Aufgeschlossenheit oder einfach einer entspannteren Aufgeschlossenheit, als jetzt so programmatisch vorzugehen. Auf die Idee würdet ihr ja wahrscheinlich nicht kommen.
Nee, also man muss sagen, es sitzen einfach mittlerweile sehr viel mehr Stimmen am Tisch, global gesehen, was die Literatur anbelangt. Natürlich auch durchs Internet, dadurch, dass die Welt insgesamt enger zusammengerückt ist, sind die Diskurse gar nicht mehr so sehr entscheidend, aus welchem Land jetzt jemand ursprünglich kommt, sondern eben, was er zu sagen hat. Und deswegen gucken wir eigentlich auch eher auf die Texte, sprechen die uns an, wird da drin etwas vermittelt, was uns elektrisiert und gucken dann, also in zweiter Linie erst, woher kommt derjenige. Und haben dabei festgestellt, dass es oft besonders interessante Texte sind, wenn die sich zwischen verschiedenen Kulturen bewegen, wenn die nicht mehr ganz deutlich einer Nationalliteratur zuzuschreiben sind, sondern vielleicht sogar in so einem transkulturellen Raum stattfinden. Also ganz einfach auch deswegen, weil ich denke, dass sich dadurch neue Perspektiven ergeben, die dann auch in neuen Schreibverfahren sich niederschlagen. Also wenn man sich zum Beispiel die Leslie Neka-Arima anguckt, die wir im letzten Jahr veröffentlicht haben, dann muss man sehen, dass sie auf der einen Seite für ein globales Publikum schreibt. Also sie hat in den USA Erfolg gehabt, sie ist in England geboren, in Nigeria aufgewachsen, lebt jetzt in den USA, hat dort großen Erfolg gehabt, viele Preise gewonnen, hat aber auch in Europa Erfolg gehabt, hat in Italien den Bridge Award gewonnen. Das ist ein Preis für die Verständigung von Italien und den USA. Und das finde ich so ein schönes Beispiel für eine positiv globale Literatur, dass eine nigerianische Autorin, die in den USA lebt, einen Preis für die Verständigung zwischen Europa und Amerika gewinnt. Und daran sieht man, dass auf der einen Seite eben diese Texte global zu den Leuten sprechen, auf der anderen Seite sagt sie aber, sie schreibt vor allem auch für ein nigerianisches Publikum. Und sie sagt, sie hat ganz bewusst da so Layers drin, Ebenen drin, die vielleicht nur ein nigerianisches Publikum richtig erkennen kann. Und das finde ich unheimlich spannend, weil da was aufbricht und da eben ganz neue Perspektiven auf die Themen, die sie behandelt, möglich sind.
Also an diesem Beispiel, das ist wirklich ein ganz bemerkenswertes Buch und das ist gar nicht mal, also es sind die Erzählungen. Erzählungen gelten ja als nicht so verkäuflich wie Romane. Nach wie vor werden hier am liebsten Romane gelesen. Aber ihr wart damit doch relativ erfolgreich mit diesem Erzählband, der genau zwischen diesen Welten spielt, interessanterweise. Und du als Übersetzerin musstest ja auch damit zurechtkommen, mit den verschiedenen Welten. Ich stelle mir vor, dass es gar nicht so einfach ist. Einmal weiß man sowieso, dass Englisch nicht gleich Englisch ist. Das, spätestens mit afrikanischer Literatur weiß man das. Oder wenn Karibik dazu kommt oder überhaupt auch amerikanische Literatur, ist jedes Mal eine Herausforderung. Auch wenn man sehr, sehr gut im Englischen zu Hause ist und trotzdem.
Das hilft eigentlich nicht sehr, sehr gut in einem Englisch unterwegs zu sein. Also man muss sich dann schon wirklich darauf einlassen. Es ist in dem konkreten Fall dann natürlich auch das amerikanische Englisch gewesen, aber das amerikanische Englisch, wie es dann auch von einer bestimmten Gruppe dann auch gesprochen wird und dann wiederum auch die typischen nigerianisch-englischen Ausdrücke und dann wieder andere Ausdrücke, die wir dann einfach haben stehen lassen, weil sie dazugehören, die wir dann nicht übersetzt haben, weil sie sind schon vielleicht übersetzbar, aber sie sollen halt eben diesen Klang dann auch noch mit transportieren. Also diese Entscheidungen, da waren wir dann doch schon sehr sorgfältig und müssen natürlich dann noch fast jeden zweiten Satz dann auch auf sowas nochmal abklopfen. Also das ist wirklich tricky und das macht aber eben auch Spaß. Also ich habe dann nochmal sehr viel sicherlich dazugelernt. Ne?
Genau. Aber apropos Übersetzen, auch da jetzt nach 40 Jahren, also ich kann das so ein bisschen den Bogen spannen, weil ich halt so lange dabei bin, war das tatsächlich früher auch so, dass man eben solche Sachen nicht hat stehen lassen, sondern es wurden Glossare gemacht. Also manchmal gibt es ja sogar Fußnoten, das ist ja ganz entsetzlich in Prosa. Aber dass man da auch ein anderes Selbstbewusstsein, und das hat ja was mit diesem ganzen globalen Verständnis auch zu tun, dass man sagt, nee, das bleibt jetzt mal stehen, das gehört in diesen Kontext, das ist nicht übersetzbar. Und der Leser muss sich dann halt mal selbst ein paar Gedanken machen, was könnte das bedeuten aus dem Kontext heraus, ohne dass es jetzt so transportiert wird?
Entweder das oder der Zugriff auf Wörterbücher ist natürlich jetzt auch deutlich leichter. Also wenn die Leute das dann lesen und sagen, hey, ich glaube, das erschließt sich mir jetzt nicht. Und dann können die das natürlich sehr schnell nachgucken im Internet. Ne? Und das hilft natürlich dann auch, aber das trägt dann eben dann auch dazu bei, dass man das sehr viel leichter machen kann, ohne eben mit Fußnoten und Glossar arbeiten zu müssen.
Ja, das aber auch den Leser fordert. Also,
ja, ich meine, das ist ja auch dann der Schritt, den du als Leserin dann noch machen musst. Gucke ich das jetzt nach oder lasse ich es einfach an mir vorbeigleiten? Und die Entscheidung, die kann man dann noch abgeben. Und das ist eigentlich auch ganz schön, ja.
Ja, ich glaube, da gibt es auch immer noch Diskussionen innerhalb der Verlage. Lässt man es, das macht man nicht, macht man es den Lesern leicht. Aber unsere Moderatorin hat vorhin auch gesagt, wir sollten das Publikum auch nicht unterschätzen. Also die Leute sind ja nicht blöd. Und wer sich aufschließt und so ein Buch liest, liest, der macht sich vielleicht auch mal einen Gedanken mehr und schaut mal was nach oder sagt, was könnte das heißen? Ja, also ich weiß, in der afrikanischen Literatur, es gibt so einen Begriff des Chi, also dieses Geistes, der dann immer noch mitlebt oder so. Warum sollte man das übersetzen in Geist oder was auch immer? Das gibt es halt
kann man, muss man aber
in
nicht.
dieser Gesellschaft. Und das ist ja auch ganz reizvoll, sich das vorzustellen. Wie ist das mit so einem Chi zu leben, zum Beispiel?
Und ich finde es eben dann auch gerade sehr, sehr schön, dass sich darüber dann nochmal was Neues dann erschlossen werden kann. Und man, wie du gerade gesagt hast, es wird ja auch dann doch sehr unterschätzt, was man dann so mitbekommt, wofür sich die Menschen dann doch interessieren und dass sie dann eher den Vorwurf machen, ihr hättet ruhig noch mehr stehen lassen können, weil das gehört doch eigentlich dazu. Also es geht jetzt, glaube ich, eher in genau die andere Richtung.
Und oft ist es ja auch so, dass es in einen Text bewusst eingebaut ist als ein Störmoment.
Ja.
Wenn diese Texte eben zwischen verschiedenen Kulturen spielen, dann geht es natürlich auch oft, haben die Figuren auch oft das Problem der Kommunikation, die nicht ganz so klappt, wie sie vielleicht klappen könnte. Und dann ist es natürlich auch im Text angelegt, dass diese Worte dann noch eine zusätzliche Atmosphäre geben.
Genau. Also es spiegelt einfach die Realität der Autoren wider, die zum Teil auch transnational unterwegs sind, wie die von euch jetzt verlegte Autorin. Und ihr werdet sicher noch ganz viele finden, da bin ich ganz sicher. Denn das ist auch da der Moment, wo sich unsere Wege kreuzen. Und also ich bin schon beeindruckt. Wir haben ja auch eine Empfehlungsliste, eine Bestenliste Weltempfänger. Eure Bücher landen da immer drauf, ja, also und das sind mehrere Menschen, die das beurteilen, und es ist ja auch kein Zufall oder dass sie dann wirklich ganz weit oben sind und wirklich Aufmerksamkeit finden. Das ist schon beachtlich.
Es ist auch, wir kennen natürlich die Litprom schon viel länger, als wir den Verlag haben, weil wir ja die Arbeit ja auch vorher verfolgt haben. Aber seit wir den Verlag haben, schätzen wir die natürlich auch nochmal aus einer ganz anderen Perspektive. Und es ist wirklich für uns so, dass wir einige Titel nicht gemacht hätten, wenn es die Litprom nicht gäbe, weil wir wussten nicht nur, dass es eine Übersetzungsförderung gibt, was für Verlage wirklich Gold wert ist, oder die Chance da war, dass wir die kriegen, sondern auch, weil wir wissen, dass ihr ein Knotenpunkt seid für sehr viel kluge Leute, die sich mit dieser Literatur beschäftigen, die das dann in ihre Medien tragen, die das in Literaturhäuser tragen, also die einfach Vermittler tätig sind. Und ich glaube, dass sich die Lage ja im Vergleich von vor 40 Jahren sicherlich sehr, sehr geändert hat, dass sie sich extrem ausdifferenziert hat, dass die Zuschreibungen eben nicht mehr so möglich sind, wie das vielleicht damals noch war. Aber umso wichtiger ist eben so eine Vermittlungsinstanz, so ein Knotenpunkt in einem Land. Nur weil es vielleicht ein bisschen mehr Bücher erscheinen jetzt aus dem globalen Süden, heißt es nicht, dass diese Bücher auf diese Vermittlung verzichten können.
Sie würden sonst untergehen.
Oh, das sind große Worte.
Ja?
Ja. Vielleicht lassen wir es dabei. Und ich freue mich, dass ihr so sinnstiftende Worte für unsere Arbeit gefunden habt und das kann ich genauso zurückgeben. Und wir werden weiter daran arbeiten. Ich darf noch erwähnen, dass Zoe Beck bei uns auch im Vorstand ist und mit weiter daran arbeitet, das Feld neu und anders zu erschließen.
Danke für 40 Jahre.
Und danke für die Einladung.
Ja, und ich danke, dass ihr dabei wart und mitgemacht habt. Ich freue mich auf zukünftige Projekte. Und natürlich muss ich mich bedanken bei der KfW-Stiftung, die uns hier diese Räume zur Verfügung gestellt und alles Weitere hat. Es war eine wunderbare Kooperation. Ich muss mich bei unseren Geldgebern bedanken, beim Auswärtigen Amt, die uns das hier mitfinanziert haben, beim Übersetzerhaus Loren, die sich für das ganze Thema mit stark gemacht haben und natürlich bei allen Beteiligten, auch unseren Helfern im Hintergrund, den Dolmetschern, den anderen Helfern, und natürlich unserem Publikum, das sich für das Ganze interessiert und immer bei uns bleibt und hoffentlich auch in Zukunft.
Yeah, nothing remains to say, but thank you. Also, we would like to point your interest towards Koleka Putuma's poetry reading, which will follow now. And after that, please join us for the virtual get-together via Zoom to discuss any question that may have come up throughout the day. Thank you so much. Thank you, Litprom. Thank you, Anita. Thank you for watching.
Hi, I'm Koleka Putuma. I am a poet, a theatre practitioner, and a writer based in Cape Town, South Africa. I'm gonna try and not make this weird for myself, I think, more than the person who's gonna be watching, just because I'm sitting in the living room by myself, sharing poems with the furniture. But I'm gonna try and make it good. The first poem I'm going to share is part of the next book that I'm writing and exploring, which is around the multiple gazes that as Black women, particularly Black women who are creatives or who are kind of perform and share ourselves through our bodies and our voices through the arts, and the multiple gazes that we have to kind of negotiate with the world and with ourselves as Black women who are either constantly looked at or constantly objectified in more ways than one. So some of these poems are from the old book, Collective Amnesia, and some of these poems are from the new work that I'm currently exploring. Europe asks if it can touch my hair. Backspace. Europe touches my hair. My braids flung across its borders. It pats me down in Dutch, colonialist memorabilia, inherited invasions, pencil test, yes sir, Aina, no sir. Raised arms and parted hips. I have mastered how not to look angry. Backspace, threatening. A visa with an expiry date and a return ticket confirms I will perform and leave. I will sign books, careful to be understood, careful to hear and spell each of their names correctly, while they mispronounce and mutilate mine. I will smile with the injury of my ancestors still hemorrhaging on my face, gather my braids back from the blue-eyed official, say dankishe, and move towards the carousel. In Europe or overseas, you are the sickness and the cure. In Europe or overseas, the platform, backspace, the stage saves those who know how to save themselves. The next poem is Black Joy, and it's from Collective Amnesia. We were spanked for each other's sins. We were spanked in syllables and by the word of God. Before dark meant home time. My grandmother's mattress knew each of my siblings, cousins, and the neighbor's children's morning breath by name. A single mattress spread on the floor was enough for all of us. Bread slices were buttered with irama and rolled into sausage shapes. We had it with black rooibos. We did not ask for cheese. We were fooled. My cousins and I, we would gather around one large bowl of umngqusho, each with their own spoon. Sugar water completed the meal. We were home and whole. But isn't it funny that when they ask about Black childhood, all they're interested in is our pain, as if the joy parts were accidental. I write love poems too, but you only want to see my mouth torn open in protest, as if my mouth were a wound with pus and gangrene for joy. There's an alarm going off somewhere. Okay, the next poem is a poem about Miriam Makeba. The new book is kind of an exploration of what it means to be made invisible by the fact that you are hyper visible or visible, I guess. And this is one of the poems that explores that question, I guess. Jukebox on demand. How many times did you have to click? How many times did you slip your mouth into a straitjacket in an interview when they asked you to ululate with pronunciation spread-eagled over your bloodlines twisting graves. Every time you were asked, so is it Mekeba, Merkurbi, Mukaba, Merkurba, Mikebe, and you, polite and unoffensive, say, Makeba, yes. Then the next poem is called 1994, a love poem. I think one of the most common things that you experience as a South African when you're traveling is that still to this day, a lot of what people associate South Africa with is the figure that was so closely identified with democracy and apartheid, which is Nelson Mandela. But this poem kind of is an exploration of what that figure means, and what that figure means outside of this context, I guess. I want someone who is going to look at me and love me the way that white people look at and love Mandela. Someone who is going to hold onto my memory the way that white people hold onto Mandela's legacy. A lover who will build Robben Island in my backyard and convince me that I have a garden, fresh air, a rainbow, and freedom. A TRC kind of lover. You don't know love until you have been loved like Mandela. You don't know betrayal until you have been loved like Mandela. You don't know fuckery until you have been loved like Mandela. You don't know soonery until you have been loved like Mandela. And this is one of the many residues of slavery, being loved like Mandela. And the last poem I'll be sharing is called Graduation. You will leave your parents... Sorry. Start over. You will leave your parents' nest, cultivate familiar traditions borrowed from your childhood. You will realize none of it is new or yours. You will work and send money home. You will work and not send money home. Earning money will earn you a seat at the grown-ups table. Contributing financially will allow you to open your mouth at the grown-ups table, but you will still watch your mouth at the grown-ups table. When you return home, you will slip into roles you have outgrown because it's easier than explaining. Your parents will get older. You will want to work harder so they can retire early. When your parents visit, you will prepare their room and hide all of the things they probably know and suspect about you. Your mother will offer to help with the cooking. The way she chops the onions is loaded with questions. You both have not mastered how to chop onions without crying. Chopping onions that way is how you have difficult conversations. You have both learned how to dance on graves without mourning what is dead or lost between you. Eventually, when your mother asks where you left the things she gave you, you will want to say, I am unlearning them. But unlearning is not a real place or destination, so you will choose to say, you do not know, and apologize out of habit. You will realize You lost some stuff between loving and leaving your lovers. You will realize your lovers gave you their mother stuff too, and that maybe unlearning should be a place, and all the women in your family should gather there more often, until unlearning is a tradition you can pass on to your children, until chopping onions is not an occasion, until you know how to hold each other at funerals and inconvenient occasions. As you get older, you will attend more funerals than weddings or 21sts. You will attend more baby showers than birthday parties. At family gatherings, you and your cousins will do the things your aunties used to do. Your baby cousins, who are not babies anymore, will sit and drink ciders with you, talking sense, finally. Time will have bridged a gap in some places and poured an ocean in others. The elders will ask you to help them understand what you do. What you do is another way of saying job. When answering, they will nod in agreement with confused eyes and pursed lips, then respond with, you know, in my time. The elders will no longer send you out of the room when unresolved family traumas ruin dinners. You will want to facilitate, using a language of grieving that will be foreign to them. You will realize the elders in the room learned the alphabet of hurting and falling apart differently. For you, healing looks like talking and transparency. For them, it is silence and burying, and both are probably valid. And then you will realize that coming home and going home do not mean the same thing. Yeah, that's me. Litprom take 4, I think.